Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Friendly Village of Mamaroneck. It's my pleasure and honor to note the fifth almost annual program that we have with the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. It's very important, particularly in light of what just happened this weekend and in the past several years. It is very important to note that while we go through all kinds of tragedies, particularly as this organization noted from the Holocaust, there are those that try and say that it never happened, or they use all kinds of excuses. Education and knowledge. If you do not remember your history and education, you're doomed to repeat yourself. I note that it's very important. It's my honor to welcome everyone here, especially Dr. David Fry, who not only is a scholar, but he's also associated with the United States Military Academy. So you get a different, broad different viewpoints that's in there. It is very important to note that this actually started, this program, with anti-Semitic spraying in the village of Mamaroneck about 6 or 7 years ago. And of course, the initial reaction was to have all kinds of meetings and protests and so on. But the true reality is that, with my opening remarks, it's more education. The more you educate people, the better the tools that we have. So without speaking, I've learned a long time ago the best speech a public official or a politician can make is a very short one. So I hope you enjoy a fantastic presentation by Dr. Fry. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Is this on? So thank you, Mayor Norman Rosenblum, and the rest of the Mamaroneck staff. We really appreciate everything you're doing to make today possible. Most of you know the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. Our mission is to enhance the teaching and learning of the lessons of the Holocaust and the right of all people to be treated with dignity and respect. What you might not know is today marks the 25th anniversary. Now I'm speaking into it. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the Garden of Remembrance. It was dedicated October 4th, 1992. If you don't know where it is, it's at 148 Martine Avenue in White Plains, across from the Galleria, next to the County Executive's Office building. The Gates of Remembrance were created by Rita Rappaport. Many of you know Rita, to memorialize the suffering and death of millions during the Nazis era from 1933 to 1945. The posts supporting the gates look like they're blown from the wind. They evoke memories of the flames of the chimneys of the crematoria. To some, they resemble the Hebrew letter Vav, which represents the number 6, and for others, the 6 days of creation, or then again, the 6 million murdered Jews. There's other symbolism on the Gates of Remembrance, such as the prisoner's number, barbed wire, broken 10 commandments. The garden walls are inscribed with names of 26 places in which Jews and other innocent victims of Nazi persecution were tortured and murdered. Of course, these represent only some of the many hundreds of locations where recorded and unrecorded atrocities occurred. Tonight, for you, we have some information about the Garden of Remembrance. It's on the table if Barbara hasn't had an opportunity to greet you and give it to you, so please take it. Also, I would like to tell you that the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center is funded almost 100% by private donations. Here's a small brochure with more information about who we are and what we do. And we are now a member organization, so we encourage you to join if you've not yet done so. I am so pleased tonight to welcome Dr. David Fry. Dr. Fry is a professor of history and director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point. At West Point, he teaches and oversees a range of modern history courses and co-chairs West Point's new Diversity and Inclusion Studies minor. As director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Dr. Fry has spearheaded an effort to increase Academy, Army, and Defense Department awareness and understanding of the phenomenon of mass atrocity, its history, and means of prevention. He has earned his PhD at Columbia University. His monograph, Jews, Nazis, and the Cinema of Hungary, The Tragedy of Success, 1929 to 44, will be on bookshelves in a few weeks, I understand. And he has chapters on military use of torture and the social practice of inequality in Nazi Germany coming out in the next year. His current research involves human rights, espionage, deportations, show trials, and the rhetoric of the Holocaust using newly declassified records of the State Department's post-World War II treaty violations program, previously classified spy ring known as the Pond, and Hungarian National and State Security Archives. Dr. Fry was a Fulbright scholar. I'm only giving you some of his bio, I want you to know, to Hungary during the fall of 2012. He's published in multiple journals. He has served on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Education Committee in Washington, D.C. since 2015. So at this time, I'm turning the microphone over to Dr. Fry.
Thank you, Millie. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to use my prerogative as a teacher to invite you to come forward. That I know even when I have cadets in the classroom, I can tell them exactly what to do. That's what I'm allowed to do. But when we even have meetings, the faculty sit in the back too. We all know these tricks. So come up, and so we can have more of a conversation, I hope, tonight. So I'm going to, first of all, I want to thank Millie, Steve, Julie for having me here tonight, and to the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Program for sponsoring this event. It's a privilege to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you. And I can tell you more about the center that I run later, but I want to get to the topic that I promised you that I would talk about, and that is a little bit about Africa, armed forces, and atrocity prevention. We're going to actually go backwards in a way. I'm going to start with the end of what I put on the slide as the description of today's talk. So a couple points that I'd like to make. What are mass atrocities? We're going to discuss that. Why are they unique forms of violence, and why do we, the US government, use that term rather than another term? How has the US government position on prevention and mass atrocity evolved since the 1990s? We're going to talk about the special roles that the military has and can or should not play in terms of mass atrocity detection, prevention, mitigation, and reconstruction. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the center I run and what we do at West Point to help prepare the students that I teach and other groups of students all the way up through military education till they're general officers. I'll talk a little bit about how I contribute to that process, and then we'll do a very specific little case study of South Sudan, and we'll talk about that near the end, and I might surprise you in the way I plan on talking about that, if we get that far, I hope. So definitions. So always start with definitions when you are a historian or when you are someone involved with this process of working with mass atrocities. So who knows what the definition of mass atrocities actually is?
The killing of many people.
Okay, many people. Well, how is that different from conflict? From conflict in general. Yes?
Well, it denotes a result. Conflict doesn't necessarily, you don't know what the end is.
Okay.
Atrocity suggests that the end is fatal.
Okay. Sometimes, but not always. Nobody else wants to make a guess?
Conflict is, there's two groups.
Okay, there you go. Oftentimes conflict is when you have two particular groups, armed groups, battling each other. The difference when you call something a mass atrocity is when the target is actually non-combatants. They're civilians. And there are 4 different types of events or processes that we consider to be part of mass atrocities: genocide, crimes against humanity, massive human rights violations, or what we sometimes refer to with the euphemism of ethnic cleansing. And what am I forgetting? I did forget something. War crimes, yes, sorry. So those are the 4 different categories of what we consider to be mass atrocities. And we use that term for what reason? Why do you think we use that term? This is the official term that the government uses to refer to these. What are we sanitizing?
It's a little easier to swallow.
Okay, maybe mass atrocity sounds better than what? Than genocide? Okay. Did I see a hand in the back?
Yeah, it's kind of an umbrella term for a more general.
It is. It's a much broader term than any of those individual ones. And in particular, we use it because we found that use of the term genocide has not been particularly fruitful. And let me explain why. When we use the term genocide, there's something very specific, a legal code or convention that we're referencing, the Genocide Convention. And in that Genocide Convention, there are very specific enumerations of what has to happen in order for something to be considered genocide. In fact, you have to have the intent to destroy in whole or in part. For most other atrocity crimes, you don't have that intent. The other problem is, intent is very difficult to establish in real time. It's often easier to establish, though it's not easy. It's easier in a place like this, a courtroom, after the event, where you can present evidence. We don't have that luxury when we are actually trying to prevent or to limit harm. And so in order to allow us the flexibility, we've adopted, as the US government has adopted this concept of mass atrocities. So let's see. How long has the Army and the US government in general been seriously thinking about this? We've been thinking about this very seriously since the publication of this book. This was in 2010. And so the planning for this book went back at least 5 years before this. This was a joint effort between the Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute and the Harvard Carr Center. And what it is a handbook for commanders in the field to deal with potential mass atrocities. This happened in 2010, and this was around a time where things began to change. It also, just by chance, happened to be the same year that the center that I run at West Point was created. And so this is when we started to consider atrocity as its own separate entity and category that we had to think about and deal with in a different way than we had before. So why is mass atrocity different than other forms of conflict, other than the fact that it targets civilians? Who wants to take a guess about that? It was Pooch, right? I'm sorry. Okay, we'll get to you in a second. She said before that oftentimes you have 2 parties when you have conflict. Right? You have clear belligerents. Is that the case generally when you have atrocities? Okay. Do you have non-state actors, militias, people with guns running around in atrocities? Yes, you have multiple actors, and oftentimes it's hard to see or hard to determine who started or who is the main belligerent, who's doing most of the killing. There is often reciprocal or revenge killing. And so these are much more complex types of processes. You had something else you were going to say.
Gonna say the same thing, but also like atrocities are just like random. Like there's no like the other person didn't do anything to you, but you just like.
Yes, you often. What he said was that you often have the people who are targeted not because they've actually done anything. It's not behavior that's targeted, it's often group. And that too, that's a very good point. One of the problems is the problem of what we call impartiality. How do you remain impartial in the case of an atrocity? Most of the time there is a specific targeted group and that you do want to try to intervene to defend a particular group. But by doing so, according to most of the laws of armed conflict and laws of war, you are actually engaging in that conflict and making yourself a belligerent. So this becomes something very, very complicated, and there generally is an escalatory dynamic in atrocity crimes that they tend to suddenly pick up and to get to a point where there are lots of crimes occurring in a very short period of time, and then they may stop, or they may, the harms may be very substantial. So you have to do a different type of preparation for this kind of problem. You have to understand the complexity. The US government had made the decision in 2011, which I'll explain, that you need to deal with it in a whole of government or an interagency way. In other words, you can't just have the State Department response where they're not talking to the CIA, where they're not talking to the armed forces. You have to actually coordinate your response if you want to have an impact. We had examples in the past where, on the one hand, the CIA was trying to arm groups, on the other hand, the same groups were being negotiated against by people in our diplomatic corps. And so we don't want those kinds of things to happen. Speed is important in these kinds of processes. In other words, you want to be able to take action quickly, as opposed to most armed conflicts that we engage in, where our strategy is mass. In other words, we want to have a larger, more powerful force assembled so that we can win the conflict. That's not the case with atrocity crimes. In atrocity crimes, it's more important that you act quickly than it is that you act en masse. The problem of criminality is also significant in atrocity crimes. You have people committing crimes, and you need to be able to actually document those crimes. You need to have witnesses. So there is a whole effort to preserve the forensic material, a whole effort to preserve witnesses, to get statements that you don't have in normal conventional conflict. Solving the problem, that's a big deal, right? How do you solve the problems that cause these mass atrocities? Though that is very difficult, as I will talk about. And these are also questions that we don't necessarily engage in when we engage in what we call typical conventional conflict. We don't think necessarily about solving the problem. We talk about winning the battle, winning the war. The solving the problems come later. As a result of this issue of problem solving, we often have to think about nation building or state building, about building institutions in ways that we don't when we talk about conventional conflict. So all of these issues, and I could go on, there are many other differences. There are all kinds of moral dilemmas that come up in atrocity crimes that don't come up, or in mass atrocities that don't necessarily come up in conventional conflicts. I'll give you an example. In Rwanda, we intervened in Rwanda. Did people know that? When did we intervene? Very late, after the actual atrocity, or after the actual genocide was over. And this was after the Rwandan Patriotic Front had more or less captured Kigali, the capital, and ended the killing. And how did we intervene? Well, we intervened by creating what we thought were humanitarian camps for people who were refugees, who had fled. Well, guess who had actually fled? The people who had committed the genocide. And so the camps that we set up actually became, in many ways, terroristic camps, where those who had fled the genocide were now mixing with those who actually had committed the genocide. And those who had committed the genocide still had arms in some cases, or at least still had mechanisms of power, and were able to terrorize those who they had been killing during the actual genocide itself. So these kinds of moral complexities are things that just aren't part of our normal military planning. Yes? Oh, that's a really good question, and this year actually, next year actually happens to be the 50th anniversary of the My Lai atrocities. And so that's a good question. That's something that we do study at West Point, but that wasn't something that I had planned on talking about today. But it is an example that we use actually, both of what happens when decision-making goes wrong, but also what happens when decision-making goes right. Because you did have an American helicopter pilot who basically threatened to fire on his own troops if they did not stop the killing that they were engaged in. And so that's that, again, that story, that mixed story we tell and we ask our cadets to think about, is to think about why did the one person on the one hand decide to kill more or less, he and his unit killed 600 or so Vietnamese for no women, children, people running away. Why did someone else say, this is obviously wrong and I'm willing to kill my own people in order to prevent more killing from happening? Yeah, I mean, this is, you're like my students. You very quickly can draw links to current events and to issues that, I think that learning about the dynamics of mass atrocity tells us a lot about the dynamics of violence in society. All right, so quick conclusion from where we are right now. Planning for a potential intervention in a mass atrocity episode is very, very difficult. Worse, a lot of the most recent literature actually indicates that military intervention is, on the whole, generally counterproductive. That more harm actually comes when military intervention occurs to stop atrocity crimes than when it does not. That is not a happy message for me to send you, but on the other hand, it is a happy message. And let me tell you why I think it is. Because what it does force us to do is to start thinking about what can we do well before people start killing each other and committing these significant acts of violence against each other. How can we mitigate and prevent those crimes before they get to the point of us thinking about military intervention? And that's where I think that the Army has a specific role. The U.S. government has placed a lot of thought into this over the last 5 years or so, and that's one area where I think we're making progress. This issue of not intervening, of not intervening militarily, and what I'll use the word kinetic operations. That's when we intervene with force. There are other types of intervention that we can talk about that don't involve putting boots on the ground, but the putting boots on the ground normally is what we refer to as kinetic operations, where people will be firing at each other. You probably, some of you may have heard or read in the Times about 2 weeks ago, there were some articles about the Holocaust Museum in DC and the report that they did on Syria, and how that report was actually withdrawn, though it wasn't fully withdrawn. The report was seemingly withdrawn because of outrage from people who support the museum, because the report's conclusion was that most likely, unless we had militarily intervened in 2011, military intervention would probably have produced either a negative or no net positive in helping end the violence in Syria and Iraq from that point on. And the supporters of the museum and many of us probably felt that how can we say things like never again and then say, well, this option that we thought would be the option for us to help the world, that doesn't do us any good. Well, that's what we're beginning to try to wrestle with, but I do think that there is a silver lining in that cloud. Okay, so there are 4 potential phases in which, or ways that the military can be involved in atrocity prevention. The first is in prediction and detection. And I'll tell you about ways that the military actually has, obviously, that allow us to do that sort of thing. It's not just the military that can do this. Obviously, this is the job of the intelligence community, to try to predict and find places that are at risk and get us to marshal our resources and put them in places where they're most needed. That's the prevention stage, right? Being able to take action to prevent the worsening of a situation. And there's a lot of tools that the military has that it can bring to bear in that case. Mitigation and intervention, that's what I would refer to as kind of kinetic operations. That might be an intervention with troops. It might be bombing. It might be something else, though. It might not be that direct use of force. It may be a show of force. It may be surveillance of some form. These are different types of ways of mitigating or intervening. And then, of course, the military, being the largest bureaucracy that we have in this country, has incredible tools for reconstruction that no one else has. We're seeing this in Puerto Rico right now, where when we have disasters like this, we call on our armed forces to help to reconstruct. So, oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So all of this involves what we call building partner capacity, that we don't want to have to do, we don't want this to fall to any particular country. We don't want to have to be the one country that always is the only one that gets involved in both atrocity prevention and, well, what I'll call upstream, midstream, and downstream prevention. So upstream is everything before you actually get an episode of killing or ethnic cleansing. Midstream is when that episode occurs, and downstream is when you have sort of the post-killing or cleansing phase, and then you try to reconstruct, reconcile, and rebuild. Yes?
What might we have been able to do in 2011 in Syria, which would have been prevention?
What might we have been able to do? So the war really was just beginning at that point. So what could we have done in Syria? Who's got some ideas? Let's see if... Well, one of the things, we talk now about the atrocity prevention toolbox. And so in that toolbox, we have things like, and I will talk a little bit about this later, we can do economic sanctions. We've all seen those before. There's evidence out there that those don't work that well. Targeted economic sanctions, where you specifically target individuals, do work, where you freeze their bank accounts, where you prevent them from having access to the international finance and the international banking system. That sometimes has a little bit more of an impact. A major diplomatic push would have been a really good idea in 2011, like force people to get to the table, coordinate with every great power to basically say, we are going to work and work and work until we get you guys to sit down. Talk of an actual UN mission at that time might have been something to consider. I see you're shaking your head a little bit, but believe it or not, some of the more recent research indicates that UN missions, despite all their flaws, are actually better than the alternatives. Right? So I think one of the things that we have to get away from is what one scholar calls the salvation narrative. And the salvation narrative is this idea that we can go in and not only stop the crime from happening, but bring the perpetrators to justice, and then leave the country with a working democracy and a working form of representative government. And that's what we all want. We do. And I'm not saying we should abandon that idea in principle. I'm saying we should abandon it somewhat in practice. We have to think of the stages that we need to get through. And sometimes the most important thing is just stop the violence from occurring so that the next stages of rebuilding can actually occur. And so that would have been whatever effort possible to stop the violence from occurring. We could have had a military strike then. We would have been risky, but we could have actually really done some damage to Assad's air force. And by doing that, that would have put him in a much weaker position. But any time we do that, there are the unintended consequences. Right? What has happened, what we did try to do, is we armed a number of rebel groups. Well, what happened with those rebel groups? If you don't continually arm rebel groups, they go to somebody else to get arms. And they get upset with you for not continuing to arm them. If you partially train them, and then you don't train them, and they're losing, and they figure, well, what else should I do? Maybe I'll just sell what I have to some other guy, and that other guy happens to belong to ISIS. That's the problem that you get. And so these problems get very complex and very difficult. And so I don't have a good answer to say, here's what we definitely could have done to stop it. And that's what the Holocaust Museum's report more or less said is, there weren't any really good answers. There's just the least worst answer. And
at that time also that we were just and maybe there were people who saw it, but we were just beginning to see it was just coming into the U.S. consciousness as a problem.
Yes.
And that's before there would have been support by the people of the country to act.
And you're right. You're very right. Because one of the things that I'm just going to be talking about what the military does. But the military can't do anything in this country, and rightly so, without the support of the public. It's civilian controlled. We have a system of elected representatives that control the military. That is the way it should be. As soon as the military gets the opportunity to act on its own, that's not a good thing. That's we can talk about that if we'd like. But what is critically important in most atrocity prevention is developing political will. And that too is an extremely hard thing to do, because it's impossible to prove that you prevented something. So I can talk to you about examples of how the U.S. government has acted in certain cases where we think we have prevented large-scale atrocity crimes. But I can't guarantee that that would have happened if we didn't do something. But I can tell you that prevention is far, far cheaper, not just in terms of materiel and cost, but in human life, than it is to wait and to not actually take steps when you are aware that violence is about to break out. And so that's the kind of the sword of Damocles that we have, is that do we want a military that just can go and act on its own? Probably not. But do we want something? Do we want the political will to be there to take action when necessary? Yes, we do. And figuring out when that's necessary is the trick. So one of the things that's really important for us to know, and one of the reasons why I think it's so important that the military studies this, is that almost 85% of the genocides that we have and mass atrocities that we have studied, that people agree fit in those categories, have occurred in the course of war. So there is a conflict going on, and that conflict develops in a way where a genocide comes out of it. There are a variety of reasons for that, most particularly because in war, especially when people think that there's an existential threat to themselves, they resort to more radical strategies, and fighting is already occurring. It makes it far more difficult for us to take steps, or for anyone to take steps to stop things. The Holocaust is a perfect example. There wasn't a whole lot more that the world could do to stop the Holocaust when they were already fighting a war using as much resources as they possibly could marshal. Now, we can discuss the questions of bombing of camps and things like that, where there may have been the ability to mitigate harm a little bit. But in terms of actually stopping the killing of the Jews in 1941, 1942, there was no one that had the capacity to do that when the Nazis decided that that's what they wanted to do. So the I'm going to move on to a quick evolution of thinking within the U.S. government about atrocity and atrocity prevention. So, since the end of the Cold War, do you think the number of atrocities has gone up or gone down? And for those of you young people out there, the Cold War ended in 1989. I know. Feels like it's gone up. How many people think it's gone up? Okay, you're not sure? You know it's a trick question. You already, okay. It's gone down, and it's gone down rather precipitously. That's good news, right? During the Cold War, during the post-World War II and up until the end of the Soviet Union, we were averaging somewhere around 9 new mass atrocities, defined in some cases by one violent event that killed over 1,000 civilians in the course of a year. We were averaging about 9 per year. Okay, now we're around 1. That's good. New ones. Okay, some are ongoing, but new ones. So why is that? Who has any ideas why? Yes. why are people more scared of the consequences now when they weren't during the... Well, we had pretty good weapons back in, I mean, we still had the capacity to blow up the world many times over during the Cold War. Had lots and lots of guns. And you don't need really complicated weapons to carry out a atrocity or genocide. Yes?
As time goes on and more relations are formed, actions usually have more consequences as they used to. So one action towards one group would now affect more groups than it used to. Does that make sense?
Actually, I think, on the one hand, you're right, but on the other hand, we've actually seen a significant decline in what we call interstate wars, so wars between states. During the Cold War, we have a lot of them, and we had a lot of proxy wars where the Soviet Union or China would back one side, we would back another side, sometimes we and China would back one side, and the Soviet Union would back the other side. It got very messy, and there were tons and tons of arms that we were providing. It was also the era of decolonization. And so you had wars of independence all over Africa and the Far East. And every one of those wars was incredibly messy. And to some extent, we're seeing the same kind of war occurring in South Sudan, which we'll get to eventually. And so that ended. And once we said, well, there's no more threat of communism, we stopped arming groups that were fighting communists. And they stopped getting arms from the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union stopped sending them stuff, couldn't afford to send them aid. That's part of the reason for the breakdown of the Soviet Union. It just basically went bankrupt. And so the end of this meant a significant decline in conflict. That does not mean we have eliminated atrocities. We've had all kinds of atrocities. We also now have the 24-hour news cycle, which we didn't have during the Cold War. We got the real introduction of that was in 1991 with the Gulf War. And so these changes in the way news is reported make it appear that we are having more conflict when in fact we have significantly less. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that we still haven't really made progress in terms of figuring out why do we have these atrocities and how can we stop them. But what you were talking about in the back, both of you guys, is somewhat of a change of norms. Right, that we now say, you know, we had the Genocide Convention and it's not okay to kill people just because of who they are, whether they're national group, their ethnic group, their religious group, or their racial group. We've now even expanded that. We've changed our ideas about national sovereignty. This has happened slowly, and to some extent there's a little bit of a reversal of that happening now, but we basically made the decision around 2005. There was something called the World Summit where they came up with this new principle called the responsibility to protect. Does anyone know what that is? What's it sound like? Okay, close. Not the UN necessarily. It could be the UN, but the idea is that somebody, I know you guys in the back, you must have, somebody knows social the social contract concept, right? I'm putting you on the spot. I know there's a teacher here, so I know you know that. What's the idea of the social contract? Anybody? I know there's a couple of former high school teachers. Oh, I really put you on the spot, didn't I? Okay. The whole idea of the social contract is that goes back to Hobbes and Locke, that the reason we join in groups, and as opposed to existing in the state of nature where we're all individuals and we all run around and we have complete freedom to do whatever we want. The whole reason we join in groups is for protection, right? Because if I can run around and do whatever I want, I can go up to you and I can say, that's a nice necklace, I'd like that. And if I'm stronger than you, that's the way it goes. That's the rule in nature, right? But you might join up with the rest of the group so that if I try to do that again, you wear another necklace and I say, I like that necklace, then all the rest of you gang up and you compel me not to take that necklace, Okay? So that's the idea of government in general, that as a group you can protect individuals better than individuals can protect themselves on their own. However, with the concept of responsibility to protect, the idea is sometimes governments fail in that mission. That sometimes they either choose not to protect their own people, or they are just not capable of protecting their own people from depredations of other groups. And so what the idea of the responsibility to protect has three different pillars. So the first pillar is that if a government cannot protect its own people, it can ask the international community, and the international community has the obligation to help. Okay. The first pillar is that it can ask the international community. The second pillar is that the international community has this obligation to help. The third is that even if the international or the country does not ask, if there are such gross violations of individual rights, because the problem with national sovereignty is basically the argument has been within my borders of my state, I can do whatever I want if I'm the government. Right? The rest of you, I know you may not like it that I'm mistreating my people, but they're my people, so you have no business. This concept or this principle basically challenges that. It says that we all, as humans, have the right and the responsibility to protect everyone around the world. And if the government can't hide behind the idea of national sovereignty to mistreat its own people. And so if there is such gross violation of human rights, or if there are atrocities going on, then the international community has the obligation to intervene to prevent those rights from being violated. And so those are the three principles of or the three pillars of the responsibility to protect. That's not a law, that's not a convention, but it has now been around enough, 12 years now, that it's been accepted as custom. Unfortunately, the first intervention based on that idea, does anyone know? The first intervention that we did based on the idea of responsibility to protect. Libya in 2011. Okay, what happened in Libya? Anybody? This guy Gaddafi, he was the dictator in Libya. There was a rebellion. He was threatening to wipe out the city of Benghazi. That meant everybody in the city of Benghazi, whether they were rebels or not. That clearly is an atrocity. To prevent that from happening, we went to the UN. The UN said, no, we don't really like that idea, but they didn't vote against it. So China and Russia actually abstained as opposed to voting against it. But what happened when we intervened in Libya? Well, we bombed the Gaddafi's army. What then happened? He was overthrown and he was killed. If you're China and Russia, how do you interpret this? Well, that's how we kind of interpreted it, but we said, well, not our problem, and that's why Libya has become a failed state. But if you're China and Russia, who didn't really like the idea in the first place because it's not like they're the cleanest people when it comes to treating their own people. Why not? Well, why would they want to vote no? What do they see this as? It's another excuse for Western imperialism. It's the West coming in and just doing regime change because they don't like the ruler in charge. And if we let it happen in Libya, they might knock on our door and say, hey, you're mistreating your people. We got the same excuse to come in and do that to you. And so they will never vote again for, well, in my lifetime probably, for any kind of responsibility to protect based argument for intervening. This is a problem, right? The way the way the UN's Security Council works, they have vetoes. And so this is the first instance of use of responsibility to protect ended up being regime change and ended up really harming the movement. So whether we continue to see progress with norms and customs is up in the air. But there has been change since 1989 about how we view the way governments are allowed to treat their own citizens. Okay, the next thing, sorry. I think I've got, yeah. No, sorry. This actually, I skipped something. In 1994, you know there was the Rwandan genocide. There are a lot of people, not just in Rwanda, but around the world who were really upset that how did this happen? And how did this slip by? How did this kind of mass killing where people were killed faster than they were killed in the Holocaust, with the exception of the end of the Holocaust when the Hungarian Jews were killed? How did that happen in today's day and age? So the US government set up something called the Political Instability Task Force, which is a kind of part government, part academic group that meets semi-secretly and does analyses of the world and looks at instances of political instability and tries to figure out where the next possible Rwanda might be. This was set up by President Clinton almost immediately after the Rwandan genocide. It's still working today, and it still provides a lot of really good information, that is, most of which is publicly available. But the reason that it's secret is not because they want to keep things away from the rest of you. It's because sometimes governments don't respond so well if you come out publicly and name them as the next Rwanda. Okay, so so that's something that we have to consider. That was in '94. I already mentioned 2005, the World Summit Agreement on Responsibility to Protect. In 2008, we got the 2006, President Bush, in his national security strategy, actually established interagency mechanisms to respond and prevent mass atrocities. This was a forerunner of something I'll describe in a moment. And then in 2008, we got this report that was commissioned by the museum in DC, but it was co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. And this task force that they had put together had specific recommendations about how we could advance and try to prevent genocide. In particular, what they recommended we do is to create a new interagency approach where we would actually have the government talking to each other. And in 2011, President Obama actually issued something called Presidential Study Directive 10, where he directed the government to study how they would actually create this organ, how they would create an interagency panel that would study atrocity and find ways to prevent it. And in 2012, we actually created it. And in 2012, President Obama made this statement, that preventing mass atrocity and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States. That is a significant statement. That actually means in every national security strategy that we produce, which we have to do, we're supposed to do annually, that preventing mass atrocity has to be part of it. For every quadrennial defense review that we do, so every 4 years, there's a big defense strategy outlook, and that has to include preventing mass atrocity. There is a similar document produced by the State Department for the diplomatic kind of outlook, and that too has to include this. The armed forces now have adopted this as part of their doctrine, the idea that atrocity prevention has to be done. Protection of civilians is now part of joint doctrine, so it applies to all of the different armed forces. That's significant. That too is a norm change that has happened over the past few years. Now, the Atrocity Prevention Board was created under President Obama, and it involves basically 11 different secretaries or assistant secretaries or undersecretaries. So these are high-ranking people across government. So they include the Department of Defense, the State Department, the United States, USAID, which is the Agency for International Development, CIA, NSA, the Director of National Intelligence, the Treasury, Justice, lots and lots of different organizations within the United States government that have to actually meet on a monthly basis. They did under President Obama. And there were sub-boards that prepared documents for them where they came up with countries that they thought were at risk within the next 12 to 16 months. And they would try to get the different agencies to start thinking about what they could do to mitigate those risks before they became apparent. The good news is that under President Trump, the board still exists. It's been reorganized. It's under a different part. The chair is always from the National Security Council. And there is a chair, Gary Hall, who is in charge, who says that they are going to meet soon. So it's not been disbanded. That's a very important thing. So we've gone from one president to the next, which is always a good sign. That's once you go from one to the next, then things start to generally continue. Right? The next president will probably also continue this process. And while the board has not met yet, there have been some positive signs. President Trump used the idea that of protecting civilians and of responsibility to protect as the justification for the cruise missile attack that we launched on Syrian chemical weapons. And so there is a precedent now within this administration to take that kind of action, and that is another example of a kinetic action that may have been able to prevent atrocity. So what we call the bottom line up front, though I'm no longer way up front, is that we now have an integrated approach to atrocity prevention within the government, and that we know what atrocity crimes are. We know how complex and morally problematic they are, and we know how the United States kind of arrived at its position for what it does for in terms of atrocity prevention now, or how it thinks about atrocity prevention now. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to tell you more about what we do specifically with students at West Point and beyond, so that we can prepare them for what they need to face. And what they often face is the violence on the ground. They are essentially our first responders. My graduates over the last 10 years have, in some cases, gone directly from West Point to their basic training, and when they finished the basic training in 6 months, they became mayors of towns in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so this is what they are facing. So we need to prepare them. What I tell them is, I'm not giving you answers. I'm teaching you how to ask questions. And we do that through a variety of different approaches. The first is, we have courses at West Point now, because this center exists, that I run, where I teach a course on genocide and I teach a course on the Holocaust. And being able to teach those courses allows us to do things with cadets that we couldn't otherwise do. But that only gets us access to a limited number of cadets. So what I also do is I work with almost every department at West Point, from our civil engineering department to our law department, to try to get them to integrate Holocaust and genocide concepts into their everyday curriculum that they teach. And so you see an example here. This is a case study that we developed called Ordinary Soldiers. That is a case study of the German army in World War II that did occupation duty in Belarus and issued an order to 3 different captains to kill Jews in their area of operations. Each one of those captains responded in a different way. And so what we do is we use that, and this has now been adopted by the Reserve Officer Training Corps for educating all cadets across the country. Everyone in the Army who is going to become a lieutenant, whether they're at West Point or whether they're at any other university across the country, is now using this to learn the principles of the laws of armed conflict. So we have them do an analysis of the actions of the Germans and apply the principles as they would if they were asked to do an Army investigation of a crime. So that's an example. You see, we also do lectures and public education. We've actually done a couple of cooperative things with the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. We had a filmmaker come and talk about his film on a Hungarian city and a teacher who investigated the Jewish past of the town and the way the Holocaust played out in that town. You see the silver-haired man in that picture. That's President Clinton. I was able to get him to come and speak about Rwanda, Bosnia, Somalia, and Kosovo, and he addressed the entire Corps of Cadets. That's what ex-presidents get to do. And my claim to fame is that I think I was able to get him for the least amount of money that anyone has ever been able to get. It cost me $98.50 to get President Clinton to speak. We had last year the Forbidden Art exhibit. That was an art exhibit that and this is part of our kind of public education. That was an exhibit of art made by victims of the Holocaust and concentration camp victims. And that was brought to us by the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. We had that in our library for a month. We do workshops and conferences, and that's where my work at West Point also expands out well beyond West Point. The workshops and conferences that we do are geared towards military education, but at the other service academies. And so some of the work that I've been able to do is to help Navy to create a course on genocide, to help make the course on war crimes and genocide that Air Force teaches be the most popular elective at the Air Force Academy. We actually had this year people from the National Defense University. They're the people who do the education for people at the level of general officer. So the important 30-year people in the Army who wear stars on their shoulders. They want us to put together a program similar to what we did for them for their general officers. So these are ways that we're doing outreach to get beyond just what's at the academy. We talked a little bit before about prediction. We're working with Penn State, Dartmouth, the 3 academies, Air Force, Navy, and Army, and the Center for Prevention of Genocide to develop what we call, what you see a picture of there, it's where it says statistical risk. It's an app. It's called the Early Warning App. And the design is to take data that we're putting together and to try to get that out to the general public. Because we are a federal institution, and by the way, I need to say that all of the comments I am making are my opinions. They are not the opinions of the U.S. government. They are not the opinions of the U.S. Army or of West Point. So I forgot about that. I have to always say that every time I speak. But that, because we are a federal institution, everything that I produce on work time has to be free. And so our hope is what we design is an app that can be distributed free to anyone who is interested in using it that will help to better inform the public. So we talked earlier about this idea of political will. One of the ways we think, and as an educator, I think I'd be terrible if I didn't think this way, that if we educate, then we can actually create political will. There's a lot of information out there about potential threats, but there's not cleared or vetted information. And what our hope is that this becomes one of those sources of vetted information. It's made to predict long-term, so a year plus out. That's what that risk assessment there does. It also has a wisdom of the crowd element where we just ask a lot of people, mostly experts, to weigh in on questions about, do you think X is going to happen in Y country within the next 6 months? We also are trying to develop a more or less real-time prediction component where we might use social media data, some information some methods or algorithms that scrape information from newspapers in multiple languages. So we're designing those sorts of things and also trying to do it in a way where we make these projects that our students do. So this year I'm working with our geography department to develop a mapping component for this. And that mapping component may be mapping of data. It may be mapping of physical space using geoinformational sciences. And so this is the type of social good that we can do with the students that we teach. Last, you see just example of cadet research and travel. You can't really see the picture at the top, but I put that one in there for a reason. That's Simone Askew. She is in a Jewish cemetery in Krakow, helping to restore the cemetery. You probably are saying, who's Simone Askew? Simone is one of my students. She is the first African-American female ever to be the first captain or the leader of the Corps of Cadets in the history of West Point. And part of the reason she was selected for that was because of her commitment to issues like genocide prevention. And she took part in a program that took her to Poland this summer, and that's where she was working on this. And so not only are we able to, my official mission as a member of the faculty at West Point is to educate, train, and inspire. And it's fun to get to inspire students like this. And this kind of study, despite the fact that it is often morbid, is really inspirational. Because as I tell the students, and I'm sure many of you know, when you meet a survivor or you meet a rescuer, those are some of the best people you have ever met. And their stories and their strength and and what they've done are incredibly inspirational. And so while sometimes you study the worst of humanity, you often get to experience the best of humanity as well. So this is the basic overview of what we do. I mentioned already ordinary soldiers. We now have also, we've had 2 postdoctoral fellows who are doing research on genocide-related issues over the last 2 years. I guess there's President Clinton again. Down at the bottom is another example of what we have. That man is Julian Kolsky. He's the son of the mayor of Warsaw, and he was involved in the resistance and was one of the people at age 14. He was a very tall 14-year-old, he tells me, and so he was able to pass for much older. He was in the fire brigade in 1943, and so the fire brigade was one of the few groups that was actually allowed into the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto, and he smuggled they were able to smuggle weapons under the fire carts, and yeah, so he came, and we also, when we get guests like that, we interview them, and we have his story available to people to see online. We do workshops as well. I mentioned one with faculty, but this one we do with cadets and midshipmen. We bring them together now to actually share work and research that they've done on atrocity issues, and to give them a forum to also to network and to inspire each other in the work that they're doing. You see the person right here in the middle. He was the Defense Department representative to the Atrocities Prevention Board. He's since moved on, but he was as of, and the person next to him, she actually is the USAID representative, but now she's at the National Security Council running the Africa desk for the National Security Council. So these are the kinds of people that we're able to expose cadets to. The year before, we had the acting secretary of the Army come in and talk to them. That I've already explained. That's another shot of the app. What we also try to do, and we talked about this at dinner, is the importance of actually giving people the opportunity to travel, especially when it comes to studying of atrocity. Getting them to go to Poland, getting them to go, as you see this other picture here on my right, is that's in Srebrenica. We took cadets to Bosnia, and we had a 3-hour meeting with the mothers of Srebrenica, and there were 7 of them, and they talked about their experiences losing 19, 22, 25 family members in the genocide in Srebrenica. That kind of experience is a life-changing experience for people, and it's important that that our students get that. So our primary initiatives: teach our fundamental courses, bring in lecturers, exhibits, and films, do the workshops, and give the cadets a chance to research and travel. Okay. Some of what we do actually then goes back to the Army. this is an example of what I did last year with students in my, my genocide course. We end the course not with a final exam, but with a tabletop exercise. A tabletop exercise is a role play. And the idea is it mimics what you would do if you were on a planning staff in one of the Army's combatant commands. There are 7 combatant commands around the world, and when a situation comes up, they're asked to respond and do something. So in this case, we studied Nigeria for the last quarter of the semester, and I gave them an atrocity scenario that they then had to come up with a response to, the initial planning for military action. And what we also did was the summer before, I sent a cadet to the War College to do research on Boko Haram and events in Nigeria. And he did some primary research. Another student from the University of Georgia did some primary research for me, wrote it and compiled it. And this now is what we call a situation assessment that the Army uses. We sent it back to the to African Command, or AFRICOM, and now it's what they give anyone who's going to Nigeria to do any kind of military relations work in Nigeria. And so this is, again, how we can use education to both inspire but also to provide a product that is necessary for the Army. So one of my aims is to try to figure out the top 15 countries at risk around the world and produce updated situation assessments for every one of those so that the Army has the best information and is also looking at the risks through an atrocity lens. Lectures will move along. Workshops, we do programs, numerous programs with the Holocaust Museum in DC. They have a special task, because they're a federal institution as well, to work with the government and with the military. And so we do a number of programs down there, including this one where we, myself and my colleague at the museum and my colleagues at the Command General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, convened about 40 different people from all parts of the U.S. government that are working on atrocity education in the State Department, in USAID, and in the Department of Defense, as well as people from the Canadian Forces College. I've even gotten cadets at the Air Force Academy to do capstone projects. And this is an example, again, of how you can integrate the study of genocide and atrocity into the work that's done in other disciplines outside of history. What the cadets did was to actually use the example of the Rwandan genocide to teach rational actor theory and game theory, to things they have to learn in their basic economics class, their macroeconomics class, yet they were actually able to incorporate use the example of the Rwandan genocide and say that if you use these theories, it can help you to explain the actions of individuals in the, or of groups in the Rwandan genocide. Okay. We'll skip the cadet research. But this is another example. The cadet, we'll skip back for 1 second. The cadet here on the bottom, again, well, as I'm facing, it's I've got to remember my left and my right. It's your left. The cadet in the white, that's Lindsay Gabo. She's now a lieutenant. She wrote this response in a national publication, in the national interest. And what it was a response to was, after the election, our election here, a colonel wrote in saying that I have a better feel for what maybe German officers must have felt like in the 1930s under Hitler. And her response was, well, he continued by saying, I don't know what I would do. Would I have the guts to actually stand up in the Army if I got an order from a commander that I disagreed with? She wrote in saying, absolutely we would. And that's what we're being trained to do. That's what we're studying. That's what we're learning to do. And it is our legal obligation to disobey an illegal order. And so, so this is, again, I think, in a way, I'm patting myself on the back. You'll have to forgive me, but this is how I feel that you see real impacts in what you do, where you, this is what I want. I want cadets who have that, have exercised sort of the moral muscle so that they're not dealing with these questions of what, you know, can I actually tell my troops not to do something, right? They have to be able to do that, and they have to know how to do that before they get out and lead in combat. Okay, more cadet travel. This is an example on the upper left of how we're working with the Department of Civil and Mechanical Engineering. We sent mechanical engineering cadet or civil engineering cadets to Rwanda to actually study modernization in Rwanda. And when I heard about this trip, I said, why don't we also send a history cadet along who can talk to them about the role of the Rwandan genocide in allowing that modernization to occur. Right? It's a lot easier to build a road if there's no one there anymore. It's a lot easier to get international aid when you're rebuilding if you justify it according to as part of reconciliation and reconstruction. And so looking at those links and looking at memorials and looking at how they're choosing to create new identity in Rwanda was part of what this trip did. Here on the bottom we have law students at The Hague. They went and visited the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Here we have cadets and faculty in Uganda actually doing work on water contestation and the role that contests over water actually play in promoting mass violence. And so these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do, and I'm pretty sure you probably had no idea that West Point is doing these kinds of things. This is a good one to stop where I can tell you, we'll stop with all the pictures about what the cadets do, but was this the person that she met? Yes, that you met? Yes. So our cadets also meet with her. Again, this is the inspiring story that you hear of someone who made the choice, who also says, you probably heard her story. No big deal, right? I just did what I had to. And right, and for cadets to hear that is incredibly important for any students to hear, for anyone to hear that, to say, I'm not a hero because I saved people, I just did what needed to be done. And that's the kind of exercising of moral and ethical thought that we want our students to, we want everyone to practice. All right, so let me skip it. Oh, our Day of Remembrance speaker last year, we had Deborah Lipstadt. We also had her show her film Denial, and she talked about it with our audience afterwards. Now we finally get to South Sudan. How much time? Are people still okay? I don't see anybody sleeping. That's good. What I would like to do is to try to actually get you to solve this problem. Okay? So who knows anything about South Sudan? It's south of Sudan. Very good. Okay, you're the expert in the room. Yes?
I know that there was a civil war that started a few years ago.
Okay.
Because there was a conflict with the president of South Sudan and his vice president.
Let's see if we can get, oops, the wrong way.
I forgot their names.
There we go.
Yeah. That. And then that created a war, and that created famine.
Okay,
And
good. Well, we got a couple.
Sent a mission a few months ago.
So we got a couple of the really important points. So first off, this is the newest state in the world. Okay, it didn't. Anyone know when it became a state?
2011.
Very good. Okay, so 2011, it becomes a state. It had been part. All right. Yes. Well, I didn't bring any gold stars to give out. I'm sorry about that. So 2011, it becomes a state. It breaks away from Sudan. Okay. It's not at that point. Surprisingly enough, it's not an actual breakaway, as in a military breakaway. There is a referendum that's agreed upon with Sudan based on an agreement made back in 2008 that the United States was very involved in negotiating. Okay. So we agree that 2011 we're going to have a referendum. If they want independence, they get independence. So they decide for independence. And what happens next? What happens in almost every one of these states in Africa? I don't know, maybe we don't know. This is part of what I teach in my African history course. As soon as there's independence. Well, why do we get civil wars? Why is this an African problem, or is this something else? Yeah, it's land, yeah.
But they're breaking ties with, they're not recognizing like cultural lines that were already previously made.
Yeah, I'm always skeptical about that because cultural lines are never straight, right? This is what most cultural lines look like. The idea of matching borders to any cultural lines is almost, I've never seen a place where that's happened. Yeah. Okay, well, what do you have to do when you have a new state? Do you have laws? Okay, you got to create the laws, right? You got to create all the rules. And so there's always a fight over who gets to create the rules. And especially in the in the 20th century system, what's been the basis for the concept of state? Right? Who gets to form states? Who are the people? It's actually a really hard question, right? Who gets to count? Right? When we formed our country, who counted? White males, basically, who owned property specifically. Okay, not anyone else, right? And so you can make decisions like that. When you do, you might have upset people. And when you've had this Cold War that I mentioned before, what came in with our Cold War? Guns and guns and guns and more guns. Okay, and so the areas are awash with weapons. And plus, what's been happening in Sudan? Well, Sudan actually didn't become a state until 1955. It had been part of the British Empire. It had been associated as part of what we called the Egyptian Sudan Commonwealth. Condominium. Thank you. And what do we know about Sudan? What was the majority religion in Sudan? Islam. Yeah. What's the majority religion in South Sudan? Well, there's not really a majority religion. There's Christianity, there's traditional African religions, animist religions, but so there is a split, but there's also just a split because it's very different. Northern Sudan, there's a lot of desert, okay? South Sudan actually has a fairly temperate climate. It's savanna. You can grow. They have regular rain. It's different than the rain we have here. Generally is only 6 months of the year that they get rain, and then they have a dry season. But they actually have land that can be farmed. They have resources, and they have oil, which is a problem. Okay? And that's all part of this. So we get a state that's not very old. In fact, it's brand new, coming from a state that's not very old, that's been fighting about who gets to control the politics since the beginning of the state. So the war in Sudan begins with independence in 1955. After that, we have basically a small period of peace in the 70s until about 1983, and then we have war starting again because the people in the south had always been ignored by the British. Most of the central government is up in the north in Khartoum. Most of the other developed part is over to the east of the Nile. That, by the way, it's hard to see here, but the Nile runs down here. Okay, so the people in the south felt like they were not being served by their state, that they were being ignored by their state, that the state attempted to actually impose Sharia law on the entire state of Sudan, and the people in the south objected to that. And so as a result, you've had rebel armies and rebel armies and rebel armies for years. I mean, this is almost the only thing that they know in their history. You also have a long history of cattle theft. Right? That part of what one of the main, most people in South Sudan are subsistence farmers, and what they're able to farm, in some cases if they don't farm, if they're not sedentary farmers, they farm cattle. And what do cattle do? This is probably not the audience that does a lot of farming, but they eat grass, but what happens when they eat the grass here? We got to go over here and eat some more grass. They move, right? You herd cattle. And so most people are what we call transhuman. They move over periods of time to different places. As you modernize and as people settle, would you like it if somebody walked their cattle through your backyard and ate your tomato plants while they're at it? Probably not. Okay, and that's what begins to happen, and we start getting this. And we also have this tradition of, if you walk your cattle over here, then they're fair game. What used to happen is tribal leaders would meet and they would negotiate what they call blood money. If people were killed or if cattle were taken, they would negotiate what the prices would be. They'd square things up and they'd say, we're okay. Right? And that's how conflicts would be resolved. But once people got guns and once tribal authority became more diminished as people get guns, tribal authority diminishes, then these systems that were in place for resolving conflict don't work anymore. And when there's constant fighting, what happens to the infrastructure of government? There isn't, right? I mean, think of Puerto Rico right now. Think how hard it is to get anything done in Puerto Rico, and that's in a developed part of the world, right? There are roads are very difficult, and there aren't that many in South Sudan. They lead generally to either directly to cities or to where the oil is. Okay? And so when you are setting up your new country and you're deciding who the people are, what are your incentives going to be? Cast the net as widely as possible and incorporate all of these people, some of whom you've had some tensions with before. Are you going to invite them in and say, sure? You could say, well, we were happy together when we were both fighting against Khartoum, but now that we're no longer fighting against Khartoum, what are we going to be doing? Fighting against each other to see who gets control of the resources and government. And so we often hear that things like this are ethnic wars, right? There are about 80 different groups of what we call ethnicities or tribes that exist and languages that exist in South Sudan. The largest group are the Dinka, headed by Salva Kiir. And the second largest group are the Nuer, headed by Riek Machar. And these are just two of the large groups. They only make up about total less than 45 or 50% of the population of South Sudan. But they live in areas that generally happen to correspond with where the oil is. Okay. They also have long been, both of these guys have long been involved in rebel politics, or rebel fighting, right? So that's what they know. They view the world as a zero-sum game, that if I don't win something, I lose it. There isn't this idea of sharing, of working together, of coming up with what's best for the community. Plus, when we form a new government, what often can we do? If the rules aren't yet made, we're forming a new government, who am I going to put in charge of the different parts of the government? Your friends, your family, and why would I put them there? Because they're the only ones I trust, right? So nepotism is a bad idea, but it comes out of, we've been fighting a lot. I don't really trust this other guy, because if I give him access to the police, or if I give him access to control of the oil revenue and taxation revenue, which, by the way, is 98% of government revenue, then he could actually use that money to basically create his own militia and get rid of me. All right? So this is the situation that we have, and this is why atrocities are so complex. Right? I haven't even talked about how the surrounding states influence this. Okay? In Uganda, we have something called the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda and Central Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, because they don't observe borders, they just move, this group moves around. They too commit atrocities. Sudan, to the north, still buys off or influences the different rebel groups to the south. Why do they do that? Do you want a strong neighbor on your southern border? Do you want them, see this area where we have a dotted line? Guess what's there? Exactly, okay? And it's claimed by both sides. And that's an area called Unity Province, Abyei. And of course, if you are the leaders in Khartoum, what are you thinking? I can pay off both of, or many of these different rebel groups just to create instability, because that makes it more likely that I'll be able to just seize some of this land back. Okay. The Central African Republic has had its own atrocities the last couple years, okay, where we actually intervened in 2014. Ethiopia is fairly stable, but over here, hidden, anybody know what's over here? Somalia, and what group is along this coast that we're really worried about from a national security perspective? Well, we do have some pirates, but that's not what we're really worried about anymore. Al-Shabaab, okay? So another Al-Qaeda-like group, but focused on East Africa, that have done some major events in Kenya, where they've killed a couple hundred people. They shot up a university a year and a half ago, and the shopping mall, exactly. Yep. So that's just in a couple different areas. Every one of these states actually supports rebel groups in other states in order to keep states on their border insecure. Every one of them has some designs in some way on whatever resources are in that particular country. In order for South Sudan to export oil, all of it has to go up north through Sudan, because that's the way the infrastructure was built when they were two joined states. And so all of that figures in, so that when we get what we call ethnic violence, I don't like that definition. We often resort, and in newspapers cover this, and they say, they've gotten better, but they generally say, these are ancient hatreds, this is violence that's been going on for a long time. No, this is actually these two guys basically trying to fight it out for control of the government, using the ethnic groups that they belong to as their base of support. They appeal to them simply because they say, I understand you because we speak the same language, we have the same background, you must support me, because if you don't, this guy is going to come after you and he's going to kill you. But this is just two of the groups, and this is why, again, this atrocity thing is a problem. My Gold Star student here said that, that there's a famine. There is a famine right now. There are approximately 250,000 people, mostly children, women, elderly, who are at risk of death right now. There are about 1.7 million others who are in what we call a food security situation, where they're on the brink of starving. Why do we have that in a country that I just told you actually has pretty good farmland? Because of war, right? They've been destroying their agricultural stocks. They've had to use the agricultural stocks because of the constant fighting. When you fight, you can't go and farm. When you steal cattle from each other and you kill people, you can't farm. You can't produce. The gross national product of South Sudan this year, or their growth rate, is negative 13%. Okay? And when you have that, and you're not producing your own food, then you have a manufactured famine, aggravated by a drought last year in 2016. Then what do? Then international aid comes in, right? And what do the people who actually control the militias and control the army actually do? Exactly. So who controls the army? Our guy on top, Salva Kiir. What's he do? He makes sure that the food goes to the Dinka. Okay. What does that do? It hardens these concepts of ethnic lines, right? The language that they speak, they're both Neolithic languages, meaning Nile-based languages. The Nuer and the Dinka are not that much different from each other. The language, their culture, the area that they're from, I think I have that a little bit later. This is an impossible map to actually make sense of, but this kind of gives you an idea, right? Here's our Dinka. Here's the main concentration of the Nuer, and the problem that I often tell my cadets with maps is, what's the problem? Oh, you guys tell me, actually, my class here. What's the problem with a map like this?
It's all mixed up.
Okay, well, yes. I mean, this is what we find is true in the world. It's all mixed up. But what else? Yeah, and guess what? Do only newer people live here? No. But does this map make it seem that way? Right, that's the problem with these two-dimensional maps that color regions in a particular way. There's only one color for mixed, right? But you could probably put that over the entire map and it'd be correct. Okay. So what we sometimes assume is that locations are places where there's only a particular type of group, and that's just not true at all. Groups are mixed. But the predominant group in these two places, again, guess where the oil is? Let's see if I think I have that on another slide. Yeah, there's our oil. Okay. Here's the line of South Sudan. Okay. It's right where those two groups are predominant. Okay. So these are that we don't need. Add to that what I would call a very, very big demographic problem. The first problem is the economy of this area. It's one of the poorest states in the world, if not the poorest. Okay. Look at the age structure. Half of your population is under 14. Wow. And the infant mortality rate is also astounding, which, by the way, infant mortality rate is one of the statistics that we use for predicting mass atrocity. That it is tied, infant mortality rate, and also incorporation, what you see below. Look at the literacy rate for women. Okay, that those two things in combination are really move. They don't predict. They don't say that if you have these two things, you are going to have an atrocity, but they are pretty good indicators of what might happen. All right, so now how many people are thoroughly depressed? Okay, so what do we? Well, you were depressed already when you came in. Is also quite high, which is somewhat surprising given this is not updated for the current famine, so I think that's about 2015, 2016. So we've gone through the problem of also what actually. There's one thing I haven't said. What would you predict is the type of government where atrocities are likely to happen? Authoritarian governments, democratic governments? Well, we would hope it's authoritarian governments, right? But this is also slightly a trick question. When do we actually start to see real risk of atrocity? When we transform from an authoritarian government to a democracy. And so, again, that's when we're fighting over who gets to make the rules, over who counts, over who gets to vote, those sorts of things. That's when we start to see, when we're fighting over representative government, that's when we start to see some real threats of, and when you pile these things on, and you pile economic inequality on ethnicity, and you compile that perhaps with religion, when all of those things correspond, that's when you get people who are more likely to resort to more radical forms of action to defend their interests, okay, or what they perceive to be their interests. And this is what we have there. You have an economic problem. You have a problem of a developing democracy. You have a problem of history. You've got this fight over resources. You've got a problem with government capacity. That's also something I've only obliquely mentioned, but there isn't a government. The government has very little capacity. It can't help its own people. And so what fills the vacuum? That's where you get ethnic-based or tribal-based militias. That's where you get people who are what we call, in the study of African history, the big men. Right? The big man is the system in Africa where it's both based on power and patronage. That you come to me, I've got some resources, I can give you a job, I can protect you, so you're going to be loyal to me. You're not going to be loyal to a government, because that government can't give you the resources and can't protect you the same way I do. And if you do show some of that loyalty, then I'm going to come knock you around. Okay?
The tribal kind of society is partly what leads to this.
It is partly what leads to it. But I think the idea of saying, because it is a tribal society, it must lead to this is wrong. That the primary cause is the fight over political power. It's not the tribal divisions in the society.
Now, when this country was formed in the 1770s, we had no rules, and somehow or other we managed to form a country without...
Right, we didn't have a demographic crisis. We also took a lot of land, and so we had resources that we could spread around equally. We also decided to exclude certain groups. We did have a set of pre-existing rules that we inherited as well. Yeah.
A better democratic system in the world.
Right, and that's the other thing is that we did have some practice with representative government, whereas they have not in this case. And so that's part of the, pardon me? They were part of the British Empire, but this was the ignored part of the government by the British essentially was through Khartoum. There was almost no attention paid and no roads built, no infrastructure built in southern Sudan, primarily because there was very little there. It was just subsistence agriculture until the discovery of oil, which didn't actually occur until around the time of independence. Okay.
Because of famine, or because of people just healthcare being so poor?
That's right. It's I don't know exactly, but it's a combination of all of those things. When you have war, I mean what I didn't mention is that 60% of the population is female, because so many men have been killed in conflict, and that too is a significant crisis. When men control the society and women are not allowed any political power, when you have so few of the women able to read, when you have them confined to particular roles. So this is all of this creates conditions that these are the things that make us nervous. Right? These are the things that that we say, wow, okay, this society is ripe for this kind of potential for mass atrocity. Luckily, mass atrocity is a relatively rare event. It doesn't mean it has to happen because of this. But clearly something is going on in South Sudan that we already consider an atrocity. So what could we do? I'll conclude, hopefully, with this idea of what can we do if you guys pretend you're the army now. We'll reverse roles. What would you recommend to a commander to deal with this society? Let's see, what else do I have? Sorry. Stay home, did you say? Well, actually, that is a response of that just say it's not our problem, and but we had a lot to do with the creation of South Sudan. In fact, without us, there would be no South Sudan. And we were very supportive of the Sudanese government until 2016, when we basically said there are just too many rights violations going on for us to continue to support Riek Machar. I'm sorry, Salva Kiir. Yeah. Steve.
On a humanitarian level, everybody did practice birth control. Because you have 5.1, I like to see that 0.19 child, 5.19, but considering the degree of fertility in women, the huge infant mortality rate, I think that's an area that they really need to control. And that is, there are too many children dying, and therefore, if there were fewer children born, there were logically fewer children perhaps dying. And then the food could be then perhaps more evenly distributed, because there obviously is not enough food. And I think with so many children, your priority is going to be probably to feed your children. But we've got to control the number of children. That's all on a humanitarian level. I think to me the more challenging part is this factionalism among the tribal groups, which is there. Yeah, it's always been in Africa, but I think it plays into, as you said, the political instability, because it's easier to hide behind the big man in the tribe. It reminds me a lot of the whole warlordism that occurred in China back with the demise of the empire, where the central control of the empire falls apart. So now you have local warlords. It's the same thing. If they were someplace else in the world, we'd call them warlords.
Right, and we sometimes do call them warlords.
Because I think, again, it goes back to that idea of the strong man. Dictatorship is control. It's not loose. Therefore, so if we have many little dictators, we have better law and order.
But what you're asking us is what we can do to prevent a mass atrocity in South Sudan.
Right.
So if you're going with what Steve said, then education, obviously, is part of it. Okay, that humanitarianism has to include education if you can hope to do something about the infant mortality rate and so forth, or the fertility rate. But you've got a more immediate problem.
Right, but those are real long-term solutions, right? Being able to actually,
You're asking also what?
Yeah, so more immediate. More immediate. What can we do?
Send in the UN to at least make sure that the international aid goes where it's supposed to?
Okay, the UN actually is there. There's a UN mission that's there. It has the authority to have about 20,000 members of this UN mission, about 18,000 troops and 2,000 support personnel. But right now it's only at about 15,000. Nobody else wants to send anybody.
I think the boundaries have to be secured also. You mentioned before all of the groups outside the country, which in many respects can be a slight distraction from trying to establish a greater stability within the country. So perhaps what we need to do is figure out a means of stabilizing all the enemies outside. Keep the enemies outside so we can now help them inside. Because if they have to worry about what's happening in Central African Republic, the Congo, and so forth, then it diffuses their ability to concentrate on their own problems.
Absolutely, but yeah, exactly. How do we do that?
How do you go about doing that?
So, I mean, we are debating in our own country our inability to control our own borders.
How about a big fence? No.
About a wall.
A wall.
I mean, but just to give you guys a sense of scale, Sudan itself, when it was one full state with Sudan, South Sudan, was over a third of the United States.
It was the largest country in Africa.
Yeah, and so we're talking about a big area of land. We're talking 14 million people or so. So yes, absolutely, it would be great to control the borders. And there are efforts to do that. In fact, we've been involved with efforts to hunt down Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army for a number of years. We've actually had a lot of success in reducing his ability to commit atrocities. And that's actually an atrocity prevention story for another time. And we've done that very easily, actually. The way we haven't caught him, but we've been able to reduce his ability to actually commit harm by a very simple solution: two-way radios. We've distributed two-way radios all across parts of Uganda. And so when someone spots people who are LRA, they actually alert other villages. They leave the villages, and there's no one there for Joseph Kony to basically force into his army and to kill. So that's been a way that the actual U.S. Army has been involved in atrocity prevention. But in terms of solving the problem in South Sudan, so what can the Army actually do? Well, this is where, and it wouldn't just be the Army, but one of the things that we could do, again, if we follow this whole of government response, is we can specifically target both of these people for economic sanctions. We can freeze their assets. And we have considered that, and I think we've frozen some of Kiir's assets, but we haven't gotten international agreement. The problem with this is that not just with international assets, but they're still getting arms, and they're actually getting heavy weaponry from, take a guess. You'll never guess. Not China, actually. Surprisingly enough, not China, though China is very involved in South Sudan because of the oil, okay? Spain, okay? Spain is selling them a lot of heavy weaponry. The Seychelles, who knows even where the Seychelles are, okay? And where do they get their arms? From France, okay? So somehow the big arms suppliers in Europe are getting their stuff in. So if we really want to actually make a difference, we can, yeah. I don't know. It's a good deal, I guess. So, yes. We're talking about probably hundreds of millions of dollars. And they both, actually, interestingly enough, they were both building huge villas in Kampala, not in Kampala, in the same suburb of Nairobi. So it gives you an idea. They're parking their money elsewhere. They're smart enough to do things like that. And so freezing those assets, arms embargo, potentially blockades, we could very much, I mean, if as the current literature seems to be indicating, UN missions actually can help, we should be helping the UN. I mean, we don't provide troops to the UN because we do not want to put our own troops under the command of other countries. We do help with some of the training and preparation, but we rarely actually help to equip UN missions. We could do that. Those are much cheaper than sending our own. Yes.
The other little quote, tribes.
Yeah.
If these guys are weakened, to what extent does that vacuum
create a vacuum?
Create
absolutely.
For
right, because these are just two at the top of the iceberg.
Guys to suddenly now
right.
surface because now they don't have the competition.
Right. So if we go back to this map, virtually every one of those different colored groups has a militia associated with it, so and has a particular strongman.
It allows the third one.
But this is where when you're talking about a full government response, this is where you also have to have negotiations ongoing. We could have spent a lot more time doing preparation for this before the actual independence vote, and gotten people to sit down and worked on constitutions and worked on power sharing arrangements in advance of the actual independence vote. Now, that's a problem from the diplomatic perspective because you're presuming an outcome that hasn't actually occurred. So that's hard to do. But you can have background meetings in advance of these events. But again, you're all stumbling upon what are some of the difficulties. Right? If you do take step X, then numerous other things occur, and sometimes they're not what we want. We found that very much to be the case in Iraq. Right, we did what was called, you heard of the Sunni awakening. Have you heard that term? Where the Sunnis were the people that were most battling us. They also felt that they had been pushed out of government. They were the rulers under Saddam Hussein. They were the ones fighting against us. We had the surge. We tried to work with them. It did work for a period of time. We bought them off. But as soon as we kind of pulled back, then there was no power sharing. And so what did they do? They took their toys and left and formed ISIS. or they actually sided with ISIS because ISIS was the only one protecting them from abuses by the Shia-led government that was excluding them. So how do you come up with solutions to these things? I'm not saying that you can't. I am saying that what we have to, when we look at these issues of atrocity, we have to presume that they are going to be really hard and not that they are simple answers, and that we have to have a much more kind of broad government response. And the Army does, as I said, have tools that we can use that are some tools that no one else in the world has. We have surveillance capability. We have abilities to do shows of force. In other words, if we want to mount, we've done this recently with North Korea. We mount an exercise or run an exercise where we show them we've got people and we've got armaments right here and we're paying attention to you. And so don't do anything silly. And so these are different ways that we can exercise force without actually deploying it. We have what we call civil affairs teams, people who actually build states from the ground up. They go and they help build wells, they help build farms, they build hospitals, they build flood-proof buildings, which is what we did in Bangladesh after the big tsunami. So these are the types of tools that we have, and we have to be willing to use them. The armed forces does not like the idea of nation building, right? They'd much rather say, our task is really just to fight and win America's wars, right? That's what they say. My answer to that is winning wars actually takes a long time. How long it takes, to actually, this is a question that actually one of my colleagues, a colonel, brought up in a conversation, and I don't think we'll ever resolve it. He said, how long do you have to win for a war to be won? And so I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I'm not sure it actually has an answer, but you can tell when you make progress over time. And I think that's where we have to, that's where we have to look, and that's what we need to try to strive to do, is to strive for progress as opposed to a clear and decisive endpoint. Yes?
One interesting thing is when these people who live in these countries leave their country and come elsewhere, they'll unite with each other. Lewiston, Maine has a large population of Somalis, and I believe the Dinka and the Noyer, they interact with each other there because they have more in common than they do with these
This is one of the issues of, I teach a course on race, nation, and ethnicity and gender, and so we talk about identities, and identities are fluid and they change in context. And so you've probably had the same experience where you've traveled abroad. You might have an identity here as maybe you live here in the village of Mamaroneck, or you live somewhere in Westchester, you're a New Yorker, you have this identity here. That means nothing to someone who you interact with in Beijing. Maybe they'll say, oh, you're from New York? Oh, you must be from New York City, because that's the only thing they know about New York. But they probably just think you're an American. Or they probably make other assumptions about you, about a much broader identity. So identities change in context, and the same thing when you're Dinka and you're newer and you come here and there isn't the same land and cattle and oil to fight over, and you find that you living in Lewiston, Maine, you're the only people who look like you do, then you suddenly find that you have more commonality than you thought you did when you were someplace else. And so not uncommon that thing happens, and that I think is also a very important lesson about about how you construct identities, and that's what has to be done. That's a really important point in South Sudan. If South Sudan is to exist as a state, there needs to be a South Sudanese identity. It has to at some point become stronger than the other.
Because I remember some years ago with young children who were being pulled into the army, and 11 and 12-year-olds were being forced to kill, and afterwards they felt they were bereft, and there was a school I remember reading about that was...
Yeah, I think you're talking about this is in Somalia. These are the Lost Boys of Somalia. And so yes, but I think you're right. Education is a way to do this, but how do you have education in a country that is the poorest, that doesn't have government capacity to build that education, that may resort to that if they have education, that there are significant differences in which sexes are allowed access to that education. I mean, that too is a big problem. One of the best ways of actually preventing future atrocity is to incorporate women. The more women that you educate and the more women you involve in the political system, the more effective you are. And Rwanda has actually done this quite well. And that's an actual success story. Now, yes?
Because majority religion, if you really call them practicing, is Christian. And
Right.
so some of the stigma that we see in Islamic countries of women not given the same opportunity would not be here with the small number of practitioners of Islam.
Correct, except that when you see any of these, the religions that are, I think with most of the monotheistic traditions, you generally see when they're practiced in these areas of the world, they're practiced in similar ways. And what I mean by that is they are all very patriarchal. They're used as justifications for denying women access to politics, education, and yeah.
Despite the fact that they be Christian, their traditions, their non-Westernist traditions can counterbalance that.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. So I have.
Just one question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
If we're talking about prevention, and you mentioned, because you mentioned Iraq, it would seem to me when we went into Iraq, there was not general acceptance of what possibly could happen in terms of an understanding of how diverse that society was. Okay, same thing in Afghanistan, and here too. How much does that discussion go on before the military takes action? I realize that comes out of the executive branch that they will do it.
Yes.
But I mean,
yes.
That is a big issue.
Well, absolutely, and I think that that's true with that there's a natural human tendency, I think, to simplify issues. We want the easy solution. We want to be able to see things clearly. That we have to fight that, or within the armed forces. We have certainly made that mistake in Iraq. We've now basically, I think we've put on what I would call Sunni Shia blinders, that we now see the world basically as we've got this division within Islam, and that explains everything. And so that, I think, is a mistake and a problem. And so this is part of the reason why I've tried to make an effort to create these situation assessments for the countries at risk, so that we do have documents that actually can explain some of the intricacies of these societies. Not all of them, but some of them, so that we have better depth of understanding. So thank you very much for your long attention. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, David, for coming. He's a real treat, isn't he? So if you're not on our email list, please make sure that you put your email on that clipboard so that you can know of our next lectures. I want to thank you again for coming, really.
Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate the opportunity. Love to teach.